I pulled into my driveway at 4:07 a.m., expecting to surprise my family after finishing a job early. Instead, the house was completely dark. Then I heard an axe striking wood behind the house. My 17-year-old daughter was outside splitting firewood with bleeding hands. "Dad, you weren't supposed to be home until Sunday," she whispered. When I asked why she was working before sunrise, she lowered her head and said, "Please, don't wake them up." At that moment, I knew something inside my own home had gone terribly wrong. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It means everything. Tell me in the comments, what country or city are you watching from? Let's see how far this story travels. A note: some elements here are fictional, shaped for storytelling purposes. No name or place reflects anyone specific, but the message woven through it is one worth sitting with. I turned onto Ridgeline Road at 4:07 in the morning after 11 hours behind the wheel, and a thermos of gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the Tennessee border. The contract in Oregon had wrapped up 3 days early equipment failure on the mill side, nothing I could fix, and instead of sitting in a motel room waiting for a Monday flight, I'd thrown my bag in the truck and driven straight through. I was 58 years old. I knew how to drive through the night. What I didn't know, what I was about to learn in the next 4 minutes, was what my house looked like when nobody was expecting me home. The first thing I noticed was the dark, not sleeping dark. Sleeping dark has a feel to it. A porch light someone left burning, the blue flicker of a TV through a curtain, the particular settled weight of a house where people are resting. This was sealed dark. Every curtain pulled tight. No lights anywhere. Not even the small green glow of the cable box that was always visible through the front window. Donna's gray Silverado wasn't in the driveway. I sat with the engine idling and looked at my house. 22 years of working timber had taught me to read a scene before walking into it. The way a stand of trees tells you what happened to the ground long before you put a boot down. Something about that dark, empty driveway was telling me something I wasn't ready to hear yet. I cut the engine, got out. The cold hit me all at once, 26 degrees, the kind of mountain December cold that doesn't negotiate. My breath came out in a white cloud and disappeared. Then I heard it, from the back of the house. Rhythmic, steady, the sound of wood being split. I went around the side of the house and stopped at the corner. She was standing in the narrow beam of the work light above the back door. A 17-year-old girl in a thin barn jacket, no gloves, splitting firewood at 4 in the morning. Ellie had a system: set the log on the block, raise the maul, bring it down clean, kick the split pieces aside, reach for the next one. Over and over. The kind of system your body develops when it's been doing something long enough that your mind checks out and goes somewhere private to wait. I watched her for 10 seconds before I could make myself speak. Her hands were what did it to me. Even in that dim yellow light, I could see them, red and cracked knuckles split in the way that happens when skin has been wet and cold and wet and cold too many times, without a break. The hands of a woman who'd worked a farm all her life. Not a teenager. Not my girl. My chest tightened so hard, I had to press my fist against my sternum just to breathe. "Ellie." She spun around fast enough that the maul swung wide and she stumbled, catching her balance. When she saw it was me, 2 things happened on her face at exactly the same time. Relief, real flooding relief, the kind that comes from being alone too long and suddenly not being alone anymore. And right behind it, something that broke my heart more than the relief had helped it: calculation. Not the calculation of someone planning anything. The calculation of someone who had learned that even good surprises needed to be assessed before you responded to them. "Dad." Her voice came out careful and controlled. "You weren't supposed to be back until Sunday." Mill had equipment problems, wrapped up early. I walked toward her. How long have you been out here? She glanced down at the woodpile. A while. Ellie, how long? Since 4, said it flat. A fact, not a complaint. I looked at the stack along the fence, enough wood for a week, split, clean, and neat. I looked at her face. She was thinner than 3 months ago, cheekbones, sharper eyes, carrying the particular hollow look of someone who hadn't been sleeping enough or eating enough or being treated like enough of a person. My throat closed up so tight I couldn't have said her name a second time if I'd tried. Come inside, I said. I've got a few more to... Ellie. I kept my voice level by pure force of will. Set it down. Come inside. She set them all against the splitting block carefully. The way you set something down when leaving things out of place has taught you consequences. She followed me in through the back door. I hit the kitchen light. The kitchen was immaculate. Not clean the way a kitchen gets clean when someone wipes it down before bed. Scrubbed. The stovetop gleamed. The counters were bare and spotless. The floor had been mopped so recently I could still see faint streak marks in the linoleum. It was 4 in the morning and my kitchen looked like it was waiting for an inspection. I stood in the middle of it and felt something cold settle into my stomach. Then I saw the hallway. The bedroom door was open 2 inches. Donna was asleep. I could hear her breathing. And in the thin slice of light from the nightlight, I could see the line of her throat, and against that line, catching the light like it had been waiting for me to notice it, a thin silver chain with a small mountain-shaped pendant. I knew that pendant. Margaret had worn it every day of the 7 years she'd been alive to wear it. I had kept it in a cedar box on the bedroom shelf for 15 years. I had been keeping it for Ellie. I pressed my palm flat against the kitchen door frame and held it there until my hand stopped shaking. Behind me, Ellie sat down at the kitchen table. She folded her cracked raw hands in front of her and waited with the patience of someone who had learned that what came next was almost never up to her. I went to the refrigerator, got the eggs, started cooking. "You hungry?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. A pause. A little. I put a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her and sat down across the table. "Talk to me," I said. "Not the version where everything's fine. The real one." She picked up her fork, and then she looked up at me. Really looked, and something behind her eyes shifted like a door that had been bolted shut from the inside, finally carefully beginning to open. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked. "The beginning," I said. "I've got time." She didn't look at me while she talked. She looked at her plate or at her hands or at some fixed point on the table between us, the way you look at something neutral when the words you're saying are too heavy to carry, and make eye contact at the same time. She ate while she talked methodically, like she'd learned to eat fast before the food disappeared. "They wake me up at 4, she said. "Every morning, even weekends." "Who wakes you up?" "Grandma Ruth knocks on my door. If I don't answer in 30 seconds, she opens it." Ellie cut a piece of egg, chewed it, swallowed. "I chop the wood first. Then I come in and start the fire and cook breakfast." My jaw tightened. "You cook breakfast for the whole house?" "Eggs, bacon, biscuits. Sometimes oatmeal if Grandpa Walter wants oatmeal." She said it without inflection, without self-pity, pure reportage, like she was reading from a document she hadn't written. "Mason likes his eggs over easy. If the yolk breaks, Grandma Ruth makes me do them again." "And you eat with them." Ellie's fork paused over her plate for just a half second. "I eat after." "After what?" "After they're done." She looked up at me then just briefly. "I eat in the kitchen, while they're in the other room." Something detonated quietly in my chest. "Ellie, it's fine, Dad. It's just how..." She stopped herself. "Reset. It's how it works." "It is not fine," I said. My voice came out harder than I meant it to. I pulled it back. Keep going. Tell me all of it. She told me all of it. She told me about the laundry piles left outside her door each night, sometimes 3-4 loads worth, and she wasn't done until midnight or later, because the machines were always occupied during the day with Donna's things and Mason's things. She told me about the floors, how Grandma Ruth would walk through after Ellie mopped and find a single streak she'd missed, and make her do the entire kitchen over again while Ruth stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, talking to Donna like Ellie wasn't 3 feet away. The girl doesn't wring the mop properly. The girl needs to learn to do things right. She calls you the girl, I said. My hands were flat on the table. I pressed them down to keep them still. Usually, Ellie took another bite. Sometimes she calls me other things. Like what? A pause. Ellie looked at her plate. You don't want to know, Dad. Ellie, like what? She set her fork down. She tells people in town that that you had me with someone you met on a job, that you brought me home because you felt guilty. Her voice was steady and clear, and completely without emotion, the way a voice gets when it's said a hard thing out loud enough times that the hardness has worn smooth. She's been telling people that since she moved in. The kids at school know. The people at church know. Pastor David Webb stopped me after service in September and told me that whatever people were saying about me wasn't true, and that God knew my name. She almost smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. He's a good man. The burning behind my eyes was so fierce I had to look up at the ceiling for a moment. Your hands, I said when I trusted my voice again. How long have they been like that? She looked at her hands like she'd half forgotten they were there. Since October, maybe. The cold makes it worse. Has anyone... I stopped. Started again. Has anyone hurt you, Ellie? Not made you work? Physically hurt you? The pause before she answered lasted 3 full seconds. Kaktia, Donna has a leather belt she keeps on the hook by the back door, she said. She uses it when she thinks I've been, she says, disrespectful. Talking back. Looking at her wrong. Ellie picked her fork back up. The last time was 2 weeks ago. Because I burned the biscuits. I stood up from the table so fast my chair scraped back across the linoleum. Dad, I'm not leaving the room. I went to the window over the sink and stood there with my back to her, gripping the counter with both hands. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn from black to the deep gray purple that comes before sunrise in the mountains. I stood there and breathed until my vision cleared and my hands stopped shaking enough that I could turn back around. I tried to leave, Ellie said behind me. Her voice had gone quieter. Twice. I turned around. She was looking at me now, directly the way she used to when she was small, before she'd learned to manage her expressions around adults. Her eyes were dry. The eyes of someone who had used up crying somewhere private and learned to move forward without it. The first time, she said, I ran in March, middle of the night. I got all the way to the Shell station on Highway 74 before Sheriff Pruitt brought me back. Something flickered across her face, not quite bitterness, something older than bitterness. Grandpa Walter called him before I even made it off the mountain. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. He called the sheriff, Jean-K. Dale Pruitt. They've been friends 30 years. She looked at her eggs. The sheriff didn't ask me a single question, Dad. He just put me in the car and drove me home like I was a lost dog somebody reported. I walked back to the table. I sat down. I looked at my daughter, this girl I had held in my arms when she was 2 years old, and screaming at the unfairness of a world that had taken her parents in one afternoon, and I felt something shift permanently inside me. Not anger. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. You said twice, I said. Tell me about the second time. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. Her knuckles were white. The second time, she said, I went to the neighbors. I sat across from my daughter and listened to her describe a life I hadn't seen coming. And the question that kept drilling into me, the one I couldn't answer out loud, was how. Not how did they do it? How did I let it happen? To answer that, I have to take you back 5 years, to a spring afternoon in Murphy, North Carolina, when I was a 54-year-old man raising a 12-year-old girl alone and telling myself every day that we were doing just fine. We weren't doing just fine. We were managing. There's a difference. I met Donna Pruitt at the Murphy Spring Trades Fair in April of 2019. She was running a baked goods booth, peach preserves, cornbread, blackberry jam, in mason jars with handwritten labels. She knew half the people who walked past by name. She called them honey and sweetheart, and remembered their kids' ages. She had the particular warmth of a woman who had spent years learning exactly what people needed to hear. She noticed Ellie before she noticed me. Is that your daughter? She asked, nodding toward Ellie, who was standing 20 feet away, studying a display of hand-carved walking sticks with the focused attention she gave everything. She is, I said. She's got serious eyes. Donna smiled. That's a good thing. Means she's paying attention. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I thought she was perceptive. Now I understand she was cataloging. She showed up at our church 3 weeks later, at the hardware store the week after that, at the school fundraiser in June. Each time with food, each time with that warm smile, each time asking about Ellie before she asked about me. By August, she was having dinner with us on Friday nights. By October, Ellie was calling her Miss Donna and laughing at her jokes. Ellie, who didn't laugh easily at anyone. I told Pete about her over the phone one Sunday afternoon. Pete Hargrove had been my closest friend for 20 years. We'd worked the same timber crews in our 30s, watched each other's backs on jobs that tried to take fingers and worse. When I called him, he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was unusual for Pete. She sounds good, he said finally. She is good, I said. Tom. He paused. You sure about that, or you just need her to be? I told him I was sure. I wasn't sure. But I needed to be, which Pete had already diagnosed correctly, and which I ignored, because I was lonely in a way I hadn't admitted to anyone, including myself. We got married in November of 2019 at the Cherokee County Courthouse. 12 people. Pete stood beside me. Ellie wore a blue dress she'd picked out herself and stood in the front row and clapped when the judge pronounced us married. She clapped. She didn't smile. I filed that away under teenagers being complicated and went on with my life. The Oregon contract came in January of 2020. Cascade Timber Group up in the Willamette Valley, 12 weeks at nearly double my local rate. Enough to pay off the truck and put 3 months of savings away. I sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork in front of me for 2 evenings before I said anything to Donna. Go, she said before I finished explaining. Ellie and I will be fine. We've got each other. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was warm and firm. You've been carrying this family alone for a long time, she said. Let me help. That's what I'm here for. Ellie was doing homework at the counter. She didn't look up from her textbook. I signed the contract the next morning. The first 6 weeks, Donna called every evening. Ellie was eating well, sleeping well, doing her homework, getting along fine. Donna described small moments, Ellie teaching her a card game, the two of them baking on Saturday afternoon, Ellie laughing at something on TV. Small, ordinary details that cost nothing to invent. In the 7th week, the calls got a little shorter. In the 9th week, when I asked to speak with Ellie, there was a pause before Donna said she was already asleep. I told myself it was a school night. I told myself 12-year-olds went to sleep at 9:30. I told myself a lot of things that year that I should have questioned. What I didn't know, what I only pieced together much later, sitting in Pete's truck in the dark, with a sick feeling spreading through my chest, was that Donna had sent her first text message to Craig Mercer on July 14th, 2020. Exactly 6 months after I drove away from Cherokee County with the radio on and the windows down, and a feeling in my chest that I mistook for hope. 6 months. That's how long the performance lasted. After that, it was something else entirely. But before Donna, before Oregon, before any of this, there was Daniel. And there is something I have never told another living person. Not Pete. Not Pastor David Webb. Not Ellie. I am going to tell you now because I am 58 years old, and I am tired of being the only one who carries it. Daniel James Calloway was my older brother by 4 years. He was the kind of man who knew every trail in the Smokies by feel, who could read a ridgeline the way other people read a newspaper, who laughed from the belly and meant it every single time. He taught me to swing an axe when I was 9 years old, standing in the backyard of our parents' house on a Saturday morning, correcting my grip with patient, careful hands. "Ah, you're fighting it," he told me. "Don't fight it. Let the weight do the work." I have thought about those words more times than I can count. He married Margaret Ann Briggs in 2003. She was a school teacher from Bryson City, quiet, precise, with dark eyes that saw through nonsense quickly and kindly. She loved Daniel the way you love someone you chose deliberately, with both eyes open. They were happy in a way that looked easy from the outside, and I knew from watching up close was anything but. Ellie was born in March of 2007. Margaret called me from the hospital, voice ragged with exhaustion and joy. "Tom, she's got Daniel's chin and my stubbornness. God help us all." I drove up that same afternoon and stood in the doorway of the hospital room, looking at my brother holding his daughter, and I felt something I didn't have a word for then. I have a word for it now. It's called grace. The thing you recognize when you're in the presence of something that was supposed to exist. In October of 2009. I was working a timber contract in Haywood County, 20 miles north of where Daniel and Margaret lived. We'd had 3 weeks of heavy rain, and I'd been watching a particular ridge on the north face of the worksite with growing unease. The soil was saturated. There was a fracture line in the granite shelf that hadn't been there in August. I reported it to the site foreman, a man named Gerald Hicks, who had been running timber crews for 30 years, and had very little patience for what he called overthinking. "It's not going anywhere, Calloway," he said, without looking up from his clipboard. "Get back to work." I called Daniel that Friday evening. "Hey," I said, "you and Margaret still planning to go up to the falls this weekend?" "Yeah, why?" His voice was relaxed, warm. I could hear Margaret in the background asking if it was me. "That north ridge above Clyde Run," I said. "I've been watching it all week. The ground up there is bad, Daniel, really bad. I think you should stay off that trail this weekend." He laughed, that big belly laugh, the one I would give anything to hear one more time. "Tom, you've been a worrier since you were 6 years old. We'll be fine. It's just a picnic, not a summit attempt. I know, but we'll be back by 4. Margaret's got a pot roast going in the slow cooker. Come have dinner with us Sunday." "Okay," I said. "Yeah, okay." I set the phone down. I stood in my cabin doorway looking out at the dark tree line. The foreman's truck pulled out of the lot behind me. I picked up the phone again, and Daniel's name was right there on the screen, one tap away. I put the phone in my pocket. I told myself I'd already said it. I told myself he was an adult who knew these mountains. I told myself the foreman had 30 years of experience, and I had 19, and maybe I was wrong. I was not wrong. The slide came down at 2:47 on Saturday afternoon. 600,000 tons of saturated soil and fractured granite moving at 40 miles an hour. It took 11 seconds to reach the trail below. They found Daniel and Margaret before dark. The rescue team led a woman named Carol Briggs, no relation to Margaret, came to where I was standing at the barrier tape. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I drove to Daniel's house. The babysitter opened the door, a 16-year-old neighbor girl with red eyes. She'd already heard. Ellie was in the living room in her pajamas, 2 years old, completely unaware that the world had just come apart. She looked up at me when I walked in and said, "Uncle Tom," and lifted her arms to be picked up. I picked her up. She smelled like baby shampoo and innocence. Walter and Ruth arrived an hour later. Ruth was barely holding herself together. Walter had the rigid, controlled look of a man refusing to break in public. And in the middle of all of it, in the middle of the worst night of all our lives, Ruth looked at a photograph of Margaret on the mantel and said, low and vicious, his whole life shortened by that woman. I was holding Ellie. I turned around and looked at Ruth. She didn't meet my eyes. That was the moment I decided. I did not decide out of nobility. I decided because I had not made the second phone call, and Daniel was gone because of it, and the very least I could do was make sure his daughter grew up without ever hearing that sentence repeated in her own home. I called Walter the next morning. "I'm going to raise her," I said. "She stays with me." Walter started to say something about family rights and what was proper. "She stays with me," I said again. And I hung up. For 15 years, I told myself that was enough. That love was enough. That showing up was enough. Sitting in my kitchen at 5 in the morning, watching Ellie eat scrambled eggs with cracked and bleeding hands, I understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that showing up isn't the same as staying present. And that the debt I owed my brother had just gotten a great deal larger. To understand how a house turns on itself, you have to understand how it fills up. Not all at once. One reasonable step at a time, each one sounding like the right thing to do. November of 2020. I was 3 weeks into my second Oregon contract when Donna called on a Tuesday evening. "Tom, I need to talk to you about something." Her voice had that careful quality, not worried, not urgent, measured. Walter and Ruth's lease is up at the end of the month. Walter's hip has been getting worse, and the stairs at their place are becoming a real problem. I was thinking we have the 2 spare rooms. It would only be temporary. I was quiet for a moment. In my chest, something tightened that I should have listened to. "How temporary?" I asked. 3 months. 4 at the most. Just until they find somewhere single level. A pause. "Tom, they're family. And they're Ellie's grandparents, technically. It might be good for her." That last sentence was the one that got me. Ellie's grandparents. I had kept Ellie away from Walter and Ruth since 2009, not out of cruelty, but out of protection. Maybe I told myself 11 years was long enough. Maybe people changed. "Okay," I said. 3 or 4 months. Walter and Ruth arrived that Saturday with a moving truck. Ruth stepped out of the passenger side, looked at the house, and said, "This porch needs repainting." That was her greeting. Not hello, not thank you. An observation about what needed fixing. They brought Mason. Mason Calloway was 7 years old, a distant cousin's boy they'd been raising since the cousin passed. He was small for his age, with Walter's square jaw and Ruth's sharp eyes, and he walked into my house like he already owned a portion of it. Donna knelt down to his level and said, "You're going to love it here, sweetheart." Mason looked around the living room and said, "Which room is mine?" Ellie was 13. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching all of this, with those serious eyes of hers, and didn't say a word. The first week, Ruth cooked every night. Pot roast biscuits, chicken pie, real meals that filled the house with smell and warmth. Walter asked me about my routes, my equipment, my plans for the property, He was attentive and interested, and said all the right things. I told myself I'd been wrong about him. I called Ellie on Thursday of that week. "How's it going with Grandpa Walter and Grandma Ruth?" I asked. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "Fine, Dad. You getting along okay?" "Sure." Her voice had that careful, managed quality that I was getting better at ignoring. "Everything's fine?" I let it go. I needed it to be fine. By January, the temporary arrangement had quietly become permanent. Walter's hip wasn't getting better. Ruth had started organizing the kitchen the way she wanted it. Donna's things moved to lower shelves, Ruth's cast iron on the top rack. Small territorial shifts that happened while I was 800 miles away. In March, I came home for 10 days between contracts. I walked in the front door, and something felt different, not wrong exactly. Rearranged. Like furniture moved 2 inches in every direction. Nothing you could point to. Just a house that no longer felt arranged for the people I'd left in it. I saw Ellie eating, standing up at the kitchen counter one morning, while the rest of the family sat at the table. I asked Donna about it that evening. "She likes it," Donna said, folding laundry with her back to me. "Teenagers are weird about their space. You know how they are." I looked at Ellie's face across the room. She was doing homework, pencil moving steadily. She didn't look up. I let it go. I needed it to be explainable. In June, I noticed the bruise. Small yellow-green fading on Ellie's left forearm just below the elbow. "Caught it on the fence post," she said before I could ask. "Fast. Too fast." "You know how clumsy I am." I did know. Ellie had always been coordinated. She'd never been clumsy a day in her life. I looked at Donna. Donna looked at me with warm, open eyes. "She scared me half to death when it happened," she said. "Came in holding her arm. I thought for sure it was broken." I let it go. That fall, Walter invited 3 families from the surrounding area to a harvest dinner at our house. He sat at the head of my table that I had bought with 8 months of timber wages, and told stories, and poured bourbon, and laughed his big, expansive laugh. Roy Aldridge from next door came, and Pastor David Webb and the Garner family from down the road. Everyone shook Walter's hand and clapped him on the shoulder. "Fine man," Roy said to me quietly at one point, nodding toward Walter. "Helped us out with the land payment last year. Didn't have to do that." "Yeah," I said. "He's generous." What I didn't understand then, what I only understood much later staring at bank statements in Dennis Crawford's office, was that Walter's generosity was the most expensive thing that had ever walked through my front door. Every dollar he lent came with a thread attached. And he was very, very patient about pulling those threads. He could afford to be patient. He wasn't the one in a hurry. One thing I should tell you, since you may be wondering, Donna never knew Ellie was Daniel's daughter. I had handled the adoption paperwork myself in 2009, and I kept the original birth certificate, the one with Daniel's name on it, locked in a fireproof box in my truck. The document Donna had ever seen listed me as Ellie's legal guardian, nothing more. I had been careful about that. Not because I was hiding it for sinister reasons, because I wasn't ready to explain to anyone, least of all a woman I barely knew, the full weight of what that document meant. Ellie told me the rest of it at the kitchen table while the sun came up outside the window, that slow, gray mountain sunrise that doesn't announce itself, just gradually makes the dark less dark until you realize you can see again. She told me about the night she ran. "March 15th, she said. "Last year, a Thursday." "What happened that night?" I asked. She wrapped both hands tighter around her mug. "Grandma Ruth had her good china out. The set she brought from her old place, blue and white flowers on the rim. I was washing up after dinner, and one of the dinner plates slipped." She paused. "It didn't even break all the way, just chipped. A small chip on the edge. And Donna hit me with the belt. Her voice didn't waver. 3 times across the back of my legs. Then she sent me to my room without eating. My vision went red at the edges. I pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed through my nose until the red faded back to something I could function through. When I waited until 2 in the morning, Ellie continued, until I couldn't hear anyone moving around anymore. I put on my heaviest jacket, the green one, remember the one you got me for Christmas 2 years ago? She almost smiled. I put $12 in my shoe. That was everything I'd saved from finding change around the house. Then I went out the back door. You walked, I asked. In the dark. In March, ran mostly. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the obvious thing to do. 4 miles down to the highway. My hands were so cold by the time I got to the Shell station that I couldn't feel my fingers. I thought about my daughter, 15 years old, running 4 miles down a mountain road in the dark in 30-degree weather with $12 in her shoe, and something shifted in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. Not anger, something older and heavier than anger. There was a trucker at the pump, Ellie said. Big guy, gray beard, Georgia plates. I asked him if he was heading toward Murphy. He looked at me for a long moment. I think he knew something was wrong. He had that look and he said, "Get in." He helped you, I said. He was going to. Her jaw tightened. We were 15 minutes out from Murphy when the lights came up behind us. Sheriff's cruiser. Dale Pruitt. She said the name the way you say the name of something that bit you. The trucker pulled over. Pruitt came to the window and said there was a report of a missing juvenile matching my description. He called you a missing juvenile. He didn't call me anything, Ellie said, and her voice cracked for the first time just slightly, a hairline fracture in all that careful control. He didn't speak to me at all. He opened the passenger door of the cruiser and stood there until I got in. That was it. No questions. No, "Are you okay?" No, nothing. She pressed her lips together hard. The trucker, he said, "Wait." He tried to say something, and Pruitt told him this was a family matter and to have a good night. My throat felt like it was closing. Grandpa Walter was waiting on the porch, Ellie said, standing there in the cold like he'd been there for hours. Maybe he had. He didn't say a word when I got out of the car. She looked down at the table. He just looked at me. That was worse than anything he could have said. And then, Donna locked my bedroom door from the outside. She said it flat. 3 days. She left food outside the door once a day, a plate. Sometimes it was still warm. The breath went out of me in a long, slow exhale. "Ellie," I said, "why didn't you call me during those 3 days?" She looked at me with something in her eyes that cut deeper than anything else she'd said that morning. "They took my phone, Dad," she said quietly. "The night I got home. Donna took it and I didn't get it back for 6 weeks." She tilted her head slightly. "And even before that, I called you in February. You remember I was crying, and I couldn't really explain why, and you asked if everything was okay, and I said yes." I remembered. God help me, I remembered. "I said yes," she continued, "because I'd already tried telling you things weren't right, small things, and every time you'd call Donna after and she'd explain it, and you'd call me back and say it sounded like there'd been a misunderstanding." She wasn't accusing me. Her voice was gentle, almost kind. That was worse. After a while, I figured, what's the point? You're not going to hear me. Not really. Not from 800 miles away with Donna filling in the gaps. I could not speak for a full 30 seconds. When I found my voice, it came out rough and stripped down. "You said twice, you ran twice." "Yes." "Tell me about the second time." She set her mug down, straightened her spine. The second time, she said I was smarter. I didn't go down the mountain. She met my eyes. I went through the trees to Roy and June Aldridge's place. Roy Aldridge had lived next door to my property for 31 years. He was 66 years old, retired Cherokee County Sheriff's deputy, built like a man who had spent his whole life doing physical work and hadn't stopped. His wife June was small and quick-eyed and made the best apple stack cake in the county, and she had a way of knowing when something was wrong before you said a word about it. They were good people. The best kind, the kind who showed up without being asked. The second time, Ellie said, was August, a Saturday afternoon. What happened? She looked at her hands. Mason broke the lamp in the living room. The tall one, the ceramic one Grandma Ruth brought from her old place. A breath. He threw a ball inside. The ball hit the lamp. The lamp fell. She paused. He told Grandma Ruth I did it. My jaw locked so tight it ached. And Ruth believed him. Ruth always believes him. No bitterness in it. Just fact, the way gravity is fact. Donna came at me with the belt. I got my arm up and it caught me across the forearm instead of my back. She pulled back her sleeve and showed me a thin, pale scar along her left forearm already healed to silver. After I went to my room, and I decided I wasn't going down the mountain again. The road was too open, too easy to follow. She almost smiled. I went through the woods instead, 400 meters through the pine stand, I said. I know every tree. She said it simply without pride. I used to walk that path when you were home, just to get some air. She had slipped out the back, while Donna was in the kitchen, and Ruth was consoling Mason over the broken lamp he had broken. 400 meters through the trees barefoot, because she hadn't wanted to take the time to find her shoes, the pine needles cold and sharp under her feet. She knocked on Roy and June's back door at 3 in the afternoon. June opened it. One look at Ellie's forearm, the welt still red and raised, and she pulled my daughter inside without saying a single word, sat her down at the kitchen table, and pressed a cold, wet cloth against the mark. Roy tried calling me 6 times. Western Oregon deep timber country, no signal. June made me tea, Ellie said. She sat right next to me and she held my hand. Her voice went quieter. I don't remember the last time an adult just sat next to me, without needing something. My eyes burned so fiercely, I had to look up at the ceiling and blink hard 3 times. 45 minutes later, Ruth knocked on the Aldridge's front door. She didn't ring the bell, Ellie said. She knocked 4 times, slow, like she had all the time in the world. June went to the door. Roy stayed with Ellie in the kitchen. That is our granddaughter, Ruth said from the porch. She belongs at home. She has marks on her arm, Ruth, June said. Her voice was shaking, but she held the door. I think she needs to stay here while we sort this out. There is nothing to sort out. Ruth's voice dropped into something cold and final. She is a difficult child. She bruises easily. Everyone who knows her knows that. A pause. Send her out, June. Right now. Roy appeared at June's shoulder. He was a big man. He filled the doorframe. Ruth, he said, I think we need to talk about Roy. Ruth looked at him steadily. Walter tells me you're still carrying that land note from 2020, $15,000. She let that sit in the air between them for exactly 3 seconds. It would be a shame if Walter needed to call that in early. Roy's face went through something I can only describe as a man watching a wall come down on top of him and being unable to move. June turned to Roy. Roy looked at his wife, then at the floor, then at somewhere that wasn't any of them. June, he said. His voice cracked down the middle. We can't. June made a sound that wasn't a word. She pressed both hands over her mouth. Ellie stood up from the kitchen table before either of them had to say it out loud. She walked to the front door herself. She did not cry. She did not look at Ruth. She stepped out onto the Aldridge's porch and said to June, "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Aldridge. It was really good." June burst into tears right there in the doorway. Ruth took Ellie's wrist, not her hand, and walked her back through the trees. That night, Roy Aldridge went to the closet in his study and took out the Nikon camera he hadn't touched in 4 years. He checked the battery. He checked the memory card. He set it on his desk where he would see it every morning. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it. He only knew that if he couldn't speak, he could at least be a witness. Good people don't always do the right thing. Sometimes they do the next best thing, the thing that costs them something smaller, but still costs them something done quietly in the dark, where nobody sees it and nobody gives them credit for it. That's what Roy and June Aldridge did for the next 14 months. I learned all of this later from Roy himself, sitting at his kitchen table the morning after I came home, his big hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his voice rough with something between grief and relief. But I'm going to tell it to you now in the order it happened, because these two people deserve to have their story told in full. Roy started with the camera. First shot was September 6th. He told me, his voice steady but low. 4:22 in the morning. I heard the back door open, sound carries in the cold, and I looked out the bedroom window, and there she was, chopping wood in the dark. I had the Nikon on the windowsill already. He cleared his throat. I took the picture before I even thought about it. 30 years as a deputy, you learn to document first and process later. 63 photographs over 14 months. Every one of them dated in Roy's careful handwriting on the back. Ellie chopping wood at 4:20 in the morning. Ellie sitting alone on the back steps, eating from a bowl, while 5 people sat at the lit table visible through the kitchen window. Ellie in a short-sleeved shirt on a November morning, cold enough that Roy's own breath had fogged the lens when he took the shot. And one photograph that Roy set face down on the table when he got to it. He didn't flip it over right away. "That one's hard," he said. June had her own way of helping. Every morning before 4 o'clock, she tied a small cloth bag to the fence post on the property line, the post closest to the back of my house, hidden from the kitchen window by the corner of the woodshed. In the bag, 2 slices of bread, a piece of fruit, whatever protein she could spare. No note. No name. Ellie knew who it was from. She never missed a morning. June told me later, her voice fierce and wet with tears. Not once in 14 months. Rain, snow, I didn't care. I set that bag out every single morning at 3:45. She pressed a hand against her chest. It wasn't enough. I know it wasn't enough. But it was what I could do without Walter coming after Roy's land, and I could not let her go out there in the cold with nothing. The gloves had been June's idea too. In November of 2023, she tucked a pair of thick, wool-lined work gloves into the bag. Men's size small, the smallest she could find at the hardware store. Ellie wore them every night she chopped wood. That was why her hands were cracked and raw instead of frostbitten. The difference between the two at those temperatures is significant. Pastor David Webb had tried a different route. He had gone to Walter first in September, sat on the porch, accepted the coffee Walter offered, and said carefully, "Walter, I've been hearing some things that concern me about young Ellie. I'd like to talk about it." Walter had smiled the way he smiled when he was absolutely certain of his position. "David, I appreciate your concern. Tom asked us to look after her while he's working. We take that responsibility seriously. Ellie's a challenging young lady, been that way since she came to live with Tom. You know how these things are with children who've had disrupted starts." Pastor David looked at Walter for a long moment. "I'd like to speak with Ellie directly. he said. Just a pastoral visit. Of course, Walter said warmly. Come by Sunday after service, we'll have lunch. Ellie was not at lunch that Sunday. Ruth explained she was unwell. Pastor David drove home and sat in his car in his own driveway for 10 minutes, staring at his steering wheel. The following Monday, he filed an anonymous report with Cherokee County Child Protective Services. He described what he had observed, the weight loss, the marks he'd glimpsed on her arm, after service, the pattern of Ellie never being available when he asked to speak with her privately. The CPS caseworker came out 3 weeks later. Walter met her at the door with sweet tea and a plate of Ruth's biscuits. He was warm, cooperative, and articulate. He described Ellie's behavioral difficulties, her history of running away, the family's genuine concern for her well-being. Ruth cried quietly at the kitchen table. The case was closed for insufficient evidence. Pastor David received the closure letter on a Thursday afternoon. He read it twice, folded it along its creases, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. He did not throw it away. I kept it, he told me later, pressing the folded letter into my hands, because I knew that one day insufficient evidence was going to become sufficient. And I wanted to be ready. Roy set his coffee mug down and reached into the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator. He pulled out a manila envelope, thick, heavy, the kind you use for documents that matter. He slid it across the table toward me. 63 photographs, he said. Everyone dated, front and back. His jaw worked hard. Tom, I need you to know something. I wanted to come to you 100 times. 100 times I picked up the phone. His eyes went red at the rims. June kept saying it wasn't our place, and I kept thinking about that land note and telling myself she was right. He shook his head slowly, the motion of a man who has been carrying a verdict against himself for a long time. She wasn't right. I should have called you. I'm sorry. I mean that with everything I've got. He set his mug down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. I told myself the system wouldn't help anyway. I'd watched Dale Pruitt drag that girl back to this house like she was a runaway dog. A deputy calling on another deputy's friend, I knew how that would go. He shook his head. That's not an excuse. It's just what I told myself. And I was wrong to believe it. I put my hand over his on the table. My throat was too tight to say much. You're here now, I said. That's what I need. He nodded. He turned the manila envelope face up and pushed it the rest of the way across the table. I opened it and started going through the photographs one by one. Before I show you what Ellie pulled out from under that bed, comment the word believe, so I know you're still with me. Because what she had been doing alone in the dark for 6 months is something no child should ever have to do. A note: the story ahead contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. If that's not for you, it's okay to step away now. I came back from Roy's at 7:15 in the morning with a manila envelope under my arm and a weight in my chest that hadn't been there when I drove home from Oregon the night before. That weight wasn't new exactly. It was more like something that had already been forming for a long time, finally solidifying into a shape I couldn't pretend wasn't there. Ellie was at the kitchen sink when I came in, washing the breakfast dishes. She'd cleaned the skillet, dried it, hung it back on the hook automatically, without thinking, the way you do things you've done 10,000 times. She heard the door and turned around. "How's Mr. Roy?" she asked. "Broken up," I said. "But good. He's good." I set the envelope on the table. "Ellie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to know before I ask it that whatever the answer is, it doesn't change anything between you and me. Understood?" She dried her hands on the dish towel, turned to face me fully. "Okay. Is there anything else?" I said. "Anything you collected, anything you saved, anything you did on your own to document what was happening in this house?" She held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Come upstairs." I followed her up to her room. The room hit me like a closed fist to the sternum, not because it was terrible, but because of what it wasn't. No posters, no photographs, no string of lights, no throw blanket, none of the soft, accumulated clutter of a teenager's life. A textbook on the desk, a library book beside it, a single blanket folded at the foot of a narrow bed. The room of someone who had learned not to accumulate things that could be taken away. Ellie knelt down and reached deep under the bed frame. Not just under the bed, but into a gap between the frame and the baseboard, where the shadow was thickest. She pulled out a phone in a cracked case wound around with a rubber band to hold the back panel on. An old Samsung 2 generations out of date, the screen scuffed to near opacity in one corner. "I saved up for 8 months," she said, holding it out to me. "Quarters mostly. Found them in the couch and jacket pockets. Bought it from a kid at school who was upgrading. Paid $30. Something moved across her face, not quite pride, something more private than pride. "They took my real phone. They didn't know about this one." I took it from her hands. It was lighter than I expected. "I started recording in June," she said. "After the second time I tried to leave and ended up back here anyway. I figured if I ever got another chance to go, I needed something people would actually believe." She sat down on the edge of her bed. "I know how these things work, Dad. I know what happens when a kid says something and an adult says something different. I've seen which one people believe." I turned the phone on. The battery was at 31%. The first video shot from the corner of the stairwell angled down into the kitchen. Donna's voice came through clearly, sharp and contemptuous, telling Ellie to redo the entire floor because there was a streak she'd missed near the refrigerator. In the video, Ellie was on her hands and knees with a scrub brush. The timestamp read 5:47 in the morning. The second video, Mason in the backyard picking up Ellie's bicycle and slamming it onto the concrete. Once. Twice. The front wheel buckled on the second impact. Mason looked directly at the camera, not knowing it was there, and grinned. Below the video, Ellie had typed a note, September 14th. "He told Grandma Ruth I wrote it into the fence." The third video stopped my breathing entirely, shot from the crack of Ellie's bedroom door looking down the hall. Donna was standing at the hallway window with her back to the camera phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was low, but the old Samsung's microphone had caught it clearly. "Craig, the paperwork needs to be done before December 15th, Donna said. "Tom's contract runs through the 20th. That gives us 5 days of overlap, and I don't want 5 days. I want it finished and clean before he even lands." A pause. She laughed, a short, hard sound with nothing warm in it. "The girl, don't worry about the girl. I've got plans for the girl." The video ended. I set the phone down on Ellie's desk. I put both hands flat on the desk surface and stood there looking at the cracked screen. "Dad." Ellie's voice came from behind me, careful and steady. "Are you okay?" I was not okay. I was the furthest thing from okay that I had been in 58 years of living. But I turned around and looked at my daughter, this girl who had bought a $30 phone with 8 months of found quarters and spent 6 months building a case alone in the dark because she wasn't sure her own father would believe her, and I said, "I'm okay." I picked the phone back up. "And I believe you." Every single word. Below the third video in the caption field, Ellie had typed 4 words. "In case nobody believes me." Ellie left for school at 8 o'clock. I walked her to the door, watched her go down the porch steps with her backpack, watched her until she turned the corner at the end of Ridgeline Road and disappeared into the tree line. Then I went back inside, climbed the stairs, and stood in front of the closed bedroom door. I had been inside that room 10,000 times. I had slept in it for 5 years. I knew which floorboard creaked, which dresser drawer stuck the exact angle you had to lift the closet door to get it to close properly. I did not know what was in it. I was about to find out. I photographed everything before I touched it, methodically, working left to right, the way you document an accident scene before you move anything. My phone camera clicked quietly in the early morning light. I had learned a long time ago in timber work that if something goes wrong, the person who documented the scene before touching it is the person whose account gets believed. I was done being the person whose account didn't get believed. The top dresser drawer first. Underneath a layer of folded scarves, 3 debit cards. None of them in Donna's name. None of them in my name. The names on them were generic, the kind of names you'd generate if you needed something untraceable: Susan M. Hartley, Patricia J. Owens, Carol A. Drake. I photographed each one front and back before I set them aside. Beneath the cards, a small spiral notebook. The handwriting inside was Donna's small, even slanting, slightly left, the way she always wrote. Columns of numbers. Dates in the left margin, dollar amounts in the middle, an account number I didn't recognize on the right. The amounts ranged from $800 to $1,900, never higher. The dates were consistent twice a month, 3rd and 17th for 26 months. 26 months of transfers, all of them below $2,000. I knew enough about banking to understand why. Federal regulations, specifically the Bank Secrecy Act, require financial institutions to file a currency transaction report for cash movements over $10,000. But banks are also required to flag suspicious patterns below that threshold. Keeping transfers under $2,000 was deliberate. Whoever designed this system understood exactly where the reporting lines were and had built the entire operation to stay comfortably beneath them. This was not something Donna had figured out on her own. I kept reading. At the bottom of the right-hand column, repeated on every page, M&D Mountain Properties, LLC. The same 4 letters over and over in Donna's careful handwriting. I set the notebook on the bed and opened the closet. 2 things on the high shelf: a locked fireproof document box I had never seen before, and my cedar box, the one I had kept Margaret's necklace in for 15 years. I took the cedar box down, opened it, empty. The velvet interior dented where the pendant had rested for so long it had left a permanent impression. My throat closed. I stood there holding the empty box for a moment, then set it carefully on the bed beside the notebook. Then I reached back up for the fireproof document box and rattled it. It was locked with a 4-digit combination. I photographed it and left it for Dennis to deal with properly. On the floor of the closet, pushed to the very back, behind a row of shoeboxes, a manila folder. Inside, a single document, 15 pages printed on legal paper with Dennis Crawford's name nowhere on it. A different firm. Asheville, North Carolina. The header read, Deed of Conveyance, Cherokee County, 47 acres timberland. My name was on the deed as grantor. My signature was at the bottom of page 14. I had never signed this document. Forgery, the act of falsely signing another person's name on a legal document, is a Class 1 felony in North Carolina, at minimum punishable by up to 12 months imprisonment for a first offense. When forgery is used to steal property, it climbs higher. I didn't know exactly how much higher. That was what Dennis Crawford was for. The land described in this document represented 22 years of timber wages. It was the physical evidence of everything I had worked for since I was 36 years old. The transferee, the person receiving the land, was listed as Mason T. Calloway Minor by guardian Walter R. Calloway. My hand was shaking so badly I had to set the document down on the dresser and step back. I stood in the middle of my bedroom and looked at what was spread across the bed and the dresser, the debit cards, the notebook, the empty cedar box, the forged deed. 5 years of my life laid out in front of me in the quiet of an early December morning while my daughter was at school and my wife was somewhere in Cherokee County, not yet knowing that I had come home 3 days early. Then I picked up my phone and called Pete Hargrove. He picked up on the second ring. I could hear morning sounds behind him, coffee maker radio on low. "Pete," I said, "I need you to drive to Cherokee County right now, and I need you to call Dennis Crawford before you get in the car." A pause. 1 second. Pete had known me for 20 years, and he did not waste time asking questions that the situation had already answered. "I'm leaving in 10 minutes, he said. "What did you find?" "Everything," I said. "Bring a legal pad." Pete Hargrove pulled into the end of Ridgeline Road at 10:45 and killed his headlights before he turned in. I'd asked him to do that, and he'd done it without asking why, which was why Pete was the first person I'd called. He was 56 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the particular unhurried way of moving that men develop after 20 years of working timber. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed, everything deliberate. He got out of the truck and looked at my face and said, "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need you to drive me to the bus station in Murphy and make sure Donna sees your truck leave." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Get in." In the truck, I told him the short version, the notebook, the debit cards, the forged deed, the video of Donna on the phone with Craig Mercer. Pete listened without interrupting, which was not his natural state. Pete had opinions about most things and expressed them freely. The fact that he stayed quiet through the whole account told me he understood the weight of it. When I finished, he said, "Craig Mercer, the real estate guy on Valley Road." "That's him. I've seen his signs." Pete's jaw tightened. "Always thought there was something oily about a man who puts his own face on a yard sign." "Pete, I need to call Donna before we leave. I need you to listen and tell me if my voice sounds wrong." He pulled over on the shoulder of Route 74. I dialed. Donna picked up on the third ring. "Tom, everything okay?" "Yeah, fine." I kept my voice easy, a little tired, the voice of a man who'd been on the road too long. "Listen, the site foreman just called. They've got an equipment situation up in the Cascades. They need me back by Thursday. I'm going to head out this afternoon." A pause. Half a second. Maybe less. "Oh." Her voice shifted, not dramatically, just a slight brightening, the way a room feels when someone opens a window. "Well, okay. You need me to pack anything for you?" "No, I've got what I need. Don't wait up." I paused. "How's Ellie, how?" "Fine," she said, immediately. "She's at school. Everything's fine here." "Good," I said. "I'll call when I land." I hung up. Pete was looking at me. "Your voice was fine," he said. "Hers wasn't." "I know." Pete dropped me at the Murphy Greyhound station at noon with my duffel bag and enough theater for anyone watching. He pulled away from the curb and drove 2 blocks, then looped back through the alley behind the station and picked me up at the service entrance. We drove north on 74 for 8 miles, turned onto a logging road I knew from a contract 3 years back, and Pete parked where the road bent behind a stand of old-growth hemlock. From there I walked. 2 miles through timber, I knew as well as my own hands, coming up on the south side of my property, through the pine stand that ran along the back fence line. I had hunted this ground since I was 19 years old. I knew where every trail camera was. I'd installed most of them myself. I set up in the hemlock grove 40 meters from the back of the house at 2 in the afternoon. The first thing I saw at 4:07 was Craig Mercer's red Ford F-150 turning into my driveway. He had a key. He used it without knocking. The door opened and closed, and he was inside my house with the same ease as a man walking into his own kitchen, comfortable, unhurried, the body language of someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required any particular consciousness. I pressed record on my phone and held it steady against the trunk of the hemlock. Through the living room window, I could see Walter in his armchair. He looked up when Craig came in. He raised one hand in acknowledgement, not greeting acknowledgement the way you acknowledge something you've been expecting. And then he looked back at the television. He had known Craig Mercer was coming. He had sat in my armchair in my living room and waited for the man who was sleeping with my wife and stealing my land to walk through my front door, and he had raised one hand. That image went into me like a splinter and stayed there. The second night was worse. I had moved position by then around to the side of the house where the kitchen window was accessible from the shadow of the woodshed. At 9:15, the kitchen light came on bright, and Craig spread papers across my kitchen table. My kitchen table where I ate breakfast when I was home, where Ellie used to do homework before they took the table away from her. Donna sat across from Craig. Walter pulled a chair up from the side. Ruth took Mason to the back bedroom. Craig moved through the papers with a highlighter and a pen, pointing at sections, explaining things. Donna nodded. Walter leaned forward to look at something and asked a question I couldn't hear through the glass. Craig answered it, and Walter sat back and nodded slowly, the nod of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed. The forged deed was in Craig's hands. He turned to the signature page and pointed at my name. I stood at the window of my own house in the dark and watched 3 people divide up 22 years of my working life across my kitchen table. And I kept the phone steady, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound. The third morning, 4 o'clock, Ellie came out the back door with the maul. I was in the pine stand. I watched her set the first log on the block and raise the maul and bring it down in one clean motion, and I thought about stepping out of the trees and telling her it was over, it was done, she could put the maul down and go back inside. I didn't, because it wasn't over yet, and because Ellie, who had built a case alone in the dark for 6 months, deserved to have the case finished properly. I stood in the trees until she went back inside. Then I walked back to the logging road where Pete was waiting with the engine running and 2 cups of gas station coffee going cold in the cup holder. "Ready?" Pete said. "Drive me to Dennis Crawford's office," I said. Dennis Crawford had been practicing property and family law in Murphy, North Carolina for 22 years. He was 61, lean, with wire-rimmed glasses and the deliberate speech patterns of a man who had learned early that imprecise language created expensive problems. His office smelled like old paper and coffee and the particular mustiness of a building that had been full of serious conversations for a very long time. He shook my hand, shook Pete's, and sat down across from us with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil. He did not offer small talk. I had always respected that about him. "Tell me what you have," he said. I laid it out on his desk in order: the debit cards, the spiral notebook with its columns of transfers, the forged deed, Ellie's phone with the 3 videos, Roy's 63 photographs, the closure letter from CPS that Pastor David had pressed into my hands that morning when I'd stopped at the church on the way into Murphy. Dennis went through each item without touching anything he hadn't gloved up for working through it, with the focused attention of a man who was building something in his head as he read. When he finished, he set down the last photograph, Roy's shot of Ellie eating alone on the back steps, the kitchen window glowing behind her with 5 people visible at the table inside, and he took his glasses off and pinched the bridge of his nose. "All right," he said. "Let me tell you what you're looking at." He put his glasses back on and pulled the legal pad toward him. "The transfers first." He tapped the spiral notebook. 26 months, twice monthly, consistently below $2,000. That's not random, that's structured. The Bank Secrecy Act requires banks to file a currency transaction report for any cash movement over $10,000 in a single day. But federal regulations also require banks to flag what's called structuring, the practice of breaking up transactions, specifically to avoid reporting thresholds. He looked at me over his glasses. Keeping transfers at sub-threshold amounts isn't just careful. It's a federal offense in itself. 18 United States Code Section 5324. Punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison. She didn't figure that out on her own, I said. No, Dennis said. She didn't. Someone with financial sophistication designed this structure. My guess is Mercer has done this before. He made a note. The LLC next. M&D Mountain Properties, the M and the D, Mercer and Donna Calloway. I'll have my paralegal pull the registration documents this afternoon. If Donna is listed as a member or beneficial owner and failed to disclose that to you, we have fraud by concealment on top of the structuring charge. Pete leaned forward. What about the deed? Dennis picked up the forged deed with gloved hands and turned to the signature page. He studied my forged name for a long moment. Forgery of a deed in North Carolina is a Class 1 felony, he said. But when forgery is committed in furtherance of property fraud, which this clearly is, it elevates to a Class H felony. That's a presumptive sentence of 15 to 20 months, with the possibility of significantly more, depending on the value of the property. He set the deed down. 47 acres of Smoky Mountain timberland. Current market value. Appraiser put it at $480,000 3 years ago, I said. Probably higher now? Dennis wrote the number down and underlined it twice. At that value, we're looking at felony fraud with financial injury over $100,000. That's an aggravating factor at sentencing. He looked up at me. Tom, I need to ask you something directly. Is there any possibility, any at all, that you signed this document at some point and don't recall it? No, I said. You're certain? I have never seen that document before in my life. He nodded once. Good. Because the signature is close but not exact, I can see the difference, and a handwriting expert will see it more clearly. Whoever forged this had access to your signature on other documents and copied it carefully, but under magnification, the pen pressure is wrong. He set it aside. Now, the child welfare component. He picked up Roy's photographs and went through them again more slowly this time. The CPS report was closed for insufficient evidence, he said. That closure doesn't prevent us from filing a new report with this documentation. 63 time-stamped photographs showing a minor performing heavy physical labor before dawn, evidence of physical discipline leaving marks, isolation from peers and support systems, food restriction. He looked at me steadily. Tom, what you have here between the financial fraud and the child welfare evidence is not a civil matter. This is criminal. My hands were flat on his desk. I pressed them down. What do I do? I said. Dennis set down his pencil. You do nothing, he said. You make no contact with Donna, with Walter, with anyone in that house. You let me work. He pulled the legal pad toward him. I'm going to file an emergency motion to freeze the joint accounts and the LLC account this afternoon. Under North Carolina law, documented evidence of ongoing financial fraud qualifies for emergency injunctive relief. A judge can freeze assets without advance notice to the other party. He looked at his watch. If I file by 2 o'clock, we can have a signed order by end of business. She finds out when her card stops working. And Ellie, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Ellie, Dennis said, is going to be the reason this case has teeth. He picked up the phone she'd filmed on and held it up. A minor who documented her own abuse over 6 months because she was afraid her own father wouldn't believe her in front of a jury. Tom, that is devastating. He set the phone down carefully. We're going to make sure she never has to be afraid of that again. Pete made a sound beside me, a short, controlled exhale, the kind that happens when a man is holding something in very hard. Dennis was already writing. Dennis called at 4:47 in the afternoon. Pete and I were in Pete's truck in the parking lot of a diner on Valley Road eating sandwiches we hadn't tasted when my phone buzzed on the dashboard. "The freeze order is signed," Dennis said. "Judge Hartley signed it at 4:15. Joint accounts, the LLC account, and the secondary transfer account are all frozen as of this moment. Donna cannot move a dollar in or out until further court order." I set my sandwich down. "When does she find out?" "When she tries to use her debit card. Could be tonight, could be tomorrow morning when she goes to the grocery store." I could hear the precise satisfaction in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who has filed the right paperwork at the right time. "She won't be able to reach anyone at the bank after 5 o'clock. She'll spend the weekend not knowing why." "And Craig?" "I've applied for a court-authorized intercept order on Donna's primary cell phone. Under North Carolina General Statute 15A. Article 16, a judge can authorize law enforcement to intercept electronic communications when there is probable cause to believe those communications relate to an ongoing criminal offense." Dennis paused. "Given the evidence we filed this afternoon, probable cause was not a problem. The intercept goes live at 6 o'clock. I looked at Pete. He raised his coffee cup toward me in a small, grim salute. The intercept produced its first relevant call at 3:47 the following afternoon. Dennis played it for me on his laptop speaker sitting at his desk, with the volume turned low and the door closed. Pete sat beside me. None of us said anything while it played. Donna's voice first. "Craig, something's wrong with the accounts. Both cards declined this morning." Craig, after a pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. "Which accounts?" "All of them. The joint account, the one at First Federal, even the other one." Her voice had dropped, controlled but tight at the edges. "Craig, what's happening?" "It's probably a bank error." His voice was smooth, even the voice of a man who made a living convincing people things were fine. "These things happen. Call the branch Monday." "It's not a bank error." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Tom called me yesterday and his voice was wrong." "I told you his voice was wrong." A pause. 3 seconds. "Donna." Craig's voice shifted, still smooth, but with something harder underneath it, like river rock under shallow water. "Listen to me carefully. Do not call Tom. Do not call the bank. Do not call anyone. I'll handle it. You understand me." "What about Ellie?" Donna asked. "She's been asking questions. She's been Craig, she sees things." "Then take care of it." His voice went flat. "You know what needs to happen. Make the girl want to leave. That's what we agreed." The call ended. Pete stood up and walked to the window, and stood there with his back to us, both hands pressed against the frame, his shoulders rigid. Dennis stopped the recording. He looked at me across the desk. She knows," I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. "She's going to do something to Ellie tonight." "I've already called Child Protective Services," Dennis said. "Given the video evidence and the intercept, the caseworker is authorized to remove Ellie from the home for protective placement. She'll be taken to the Aldridge's house within the hour." He looked at me steadily. "Ellie will be safe tonight, Tom. I need you to focus on what comes next." I pressed the heels of both hands against my eyes and breathed. "All right," I said. "All right." That evening, Pete and I sat on the porch of his cabin 8 miles outside Murphy in the cold, with the stars coming out hard and bright over the ridgeline the way they do in December at elevation. Pete had made coffee. I held the mug without drinking it. "Tell me about the necklace," Pete said. I looked at him. He was watching me with that steady, patient attention. He'd always had the attention of a man who understood that sometimes the thing a person needed to say was the last thing they were going to lead with. So I told him about Margaret. I told him about the silver chain with the mountain pendant that Margaret had worn every day of the 7 years she was alive to wear it, about finding it still around her neck in the wreckage of that Haywood County hillside, about keeping it in the cedar box on the bedroom shelf for 15 years, checking on it every few months, waiting for the right moment to give it to Ellie. About the day I opened the box and found it empty. I convinced myself I'd moved it, I said. During the renovation we did on the spare room, I tore the bedroom apart twice looking. Eventually I stopped looking because every time I opened that box and saw the empty space, something in my chest just seized up. Pete was quiet for a moment. And now you know where it went. Donna found it when she was going through the bedroom. She read the inscription on the back of the pendant. My jaw tightened. The name Ellie engraved in the silver. Daniel had it done the day Ellie was born. I set the coffee mug down on the porch railing. Donna knew exactly what that necklace was. She knew who it belonged to, and she put it around her own neck and wore it in front of Ellie every single day. Pete made a sound low in his throat. Not a word, just a sound. Ellie never asked about it, I said. She recognized it, I know she did, she'd seen photographs, but she never asked. Because she'd learned that asking for things in that house had a cost. I looked out at the dark ridgeline. Donna wore my dead sister-in-law's necklace around her throat for 2 years, and my daughter watched and said nothing, because she'd learned that saying nothing was how you survived. Pete picked up his coffee, set it back down without drinking. Where is it now? On Donna's neck. I turned to look at him. I'm going to get it back, at the right moment, in front of the right people. Pete looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, December 20th. December 20th, I said. The Christmas community potluck. 60 families. Every person in Cherokee County who had heard Walter Calloway call my daughter a bastard child for 15 years. That was the right moment. Those were the right people. 17 days between the afternoon I sat on Pete's porch and the evening of December 20th. I'm going to tell you what those 17 days looked like because people sometimes think that justice arrives like a thunderstorm, sudden, dramatic, out of a clear sky. It doesn't. Justice looks like 17 days of paperwork and phone calls and sitting in Dennis Crawford's office at 8 in the morning, going through documents line by line while someone refills the coffee and nobody says anything inspiring. It looks like work. Patient, careful, unglamorous work. Ellie was at Roy and June's house. The first morning, June put breakfast on the table, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, and Ellie sat down in the chair June pulled out for her, and then immediately stood back up. She stood there for a moment, holding the back of the chair, like her body didn't know what to do with the instruction to sit down at a table and eat. Honey, June said, her voice breaking open at the seams. You sit right there. That's your seat. Nobody's taking your plate. Ellie sat down. She ate everything on the plate, and June refilled it without asking, and Ellie ate that too. And June went to the kitchen and pressed both hands over her mouth and cried silently into the dish towel so Ellie wouldn't hear. I visited every evening after dark. I parked 2 streets over and walked. We sat on Roy's back porch with blankets and hot chocolate, and I told Ellie what was happening, not everything, not the legal details she didn't need yet, but enough. Enough so she knew it was moving. Enough so she knew she wasn't waiting alone. Is it going to work? She asked me the third evening. Yes, I said. Not because I was certain, because she needed to hear it from someone who believed it, and I had decided to be that person. She nodded once, pulled her blanket tighter. Okay, she said. Okay. Dennis filed the emergency protective order for Ellie on December 9th, Under North Carolina General Statute 7B, a court can issue an emergency protective order for a minor when there is credible evidence of abuse or neglect. The order prohibits contact between the minor and the alleged abuser without court supervision. Dennis filed it with Roy's 63 photographs, Ellie's 6 months of video documentation, and the CPS closure letter that Pastor David had kept in his desk drawer for 14 months. The order was signed the same afternoon. Pastor David met me at the church on December 10th. He had the closure letter ready before I knocked, sitting on the corner of his desk in a manila envelope with my name written on the front, in his careful handwriting. I prayed about whether to file that report, he said, standing in the doorway of his office. His voice was rough. After Walter made it clear he wasn't going to listen to me, I didn't know if it would do any good. The system didn't help her. He pressed the envelope into my hands. But I kept the letter. I kept it because I have always believed that documentation matters even when it fails. Especially when it fails. It didn't fail, I told him. It's the piece that shows the pattern. 1 report is a complaint. 2 reports is a pattern. Patterns are what prosecutors build cases on. He gripped my hand with both of his and held it. Sheriff James Adler was not Dale Pruitt. Adler had been elected Cherokee County Sheriff in 2022, 2 years after Pruitt retired, under circumstances that the local paper had described as amicably and that Pete had described more accurately as under pressure. Adler was 44, former SBI State Bureau of Investigation, with 15 years of financial crimes experience, before he came back to Cherokee County to run for local office. Dennis had called him on December 8th. Adler had driven to the office, sat across from Dennis's desk, gone through every piece of evidence in the same methodical way Dennis had, and at the end said, "You want Craig Mercer at the potluck." "I want Craig Mercer in handcuffs before Walter Calloway finishes his announcement," Dennis said. Adler thought about it for a moment. "I'll have 2 deputies there in plain clothes, both from the Swain County office, nobody local who Mercer or Walter might recognize. You give me the signal, they move." He stood up and put his hat back on. "I've been watching Mercer for 2 years. He's pulled this in Swain County and Jackson County both. Nobody's had enough to move on him until now. The night before the potluck, I sat at Roy's kitchen table with Ellie. Roy and June had gone to bed early to give us the room. The house was warm and smelled like June's cooking and the pine wreath she'd hung over the kitchen window. Ellie had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Her hands were healing. The cracks in her knuckles were closing. The redness was fading. In another week, they would look like a teenager's hands again. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," I said. "I know." She looked at me steadily. "Are you going to be okay?" The fact that she was asking about me after everything she had been through made my throat close so fast I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. "Yeah," I said when I could speak. "I'm going to be okay." I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. "There's something I haven't told you yet. Something about who you are. I'm going to tell you tomorrow in front of everyone. Because the people who need to hear it most are going to be there." Ellie looked at me. Her eyes were very still. "It's about my brother Daniel," I said. "Your father." Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. Something more like the expression of a person who has been standing at a locked door for a very long time and has just heard a key turn in the lock. "Okay," she said softly. "Tell me tomorrow." I squeezed her hands once, then I let go. Outside Roy's kitchen window, the December night was cold and clear and full of stars. One more day. The Cherokee County Christmas Community Potluck had been running for 23 years on the same patch of flat ground behind the volunteer fire station on Valley Road. Long tables draped in white cloth. Fire pits at each end. Every family brought a dish. No assignments, No sign-up sheet. Just the accumulated understanding of a community that had been feeding itself through hard winters long enough to know what was needed without being told. Walter Calloway had sent handwritten invitations to 62 households. I arrived at 5:30 with Pete on my left and Dennis on my right, and Ellie walking beside me, her hands in the pockets of the wool coat June had bought her the week before. Donna was already there. She was standing near the far fire pit with Ruth, both of them in good coats, both of them composed in the specific way of people who have spent the past 2 weeks managing uncertainty and are very tired of it. Donna's debit cards had stopped working 12 days ago. She had called Craig every day since. Craig had told her every day it was under control. It was not under control. Walter was working the crowd the way he always worked. A crowd moving from group to group handshake and shoulder clasp. And that big laugh, leaving every conversation with the person feeling seen and warmed. He spotted me from across the tables, and his face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went absolutely still for half a second before the smile came back up, like a machine resetting. He crossed toward me, extended his hand. "Tom," he said. "Didn't know you were back." "I got in a few days ago," I said. I shook his hand. His grip was firm and dry and told me nothing. "Good turnout." "Always is." He looked at Ellie. Something moved behind his eyes, quick gone. "Ellie, good to see you out." Ellie looked at him with those steady brown eyes of hers and said, "Hello, Walter." Not Grandpa. Not Sir. Walter. His jaw tightened by a fraction, and she held his gaze until he looked away. That was my girl. Craig Mercer arrived at 6:15, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident he was feeling. He came through the entrance in a good jacket, hands in his pockets, with the easy bearing of a man attending a social event he'd been invited to. He hadn't been invited. But Walter had told him to come, and Craig had believed that Walter's authority in this county extended to community gatherings the same way it extended to everything else. He was wrong about that. Walter's authority had a very specific expiration date. I found it at 6:20. The expiration date was when Dennis nodded to me from across the tables. I stood up. The conversations around me tapered off the way conversations do when someone stands up at a dinner and looks like they're about to say something. Walter was 3 tables away. He saw me stand, and his hand tightened around his bourbon glass. "I want to say something," I said. My voice carried in the cold air without effort. 30 years of calling across timber yards had given me a voice that traveled. "I know this isn't the usual order of things, but I've got something that belongs to this community, and I'd like to put it on the table." I placed the spiral notebook on the white tablecloth in front of me. 26 months, I said. Twice a month. Always under $2,000, structured that way deliberately to avoid federal bank reporting requirements. $38,400 transferred out of my accounts into a company called M&D Mountain Properties, LLC, which is jointly owned by my wife Donna and Craig Mercer. I looked at Craig across the tables. He had gone very still. "Craig, you want to tell these folks what M&D stands for, or should I?" Craig's face was doing the calculation. How fast could he get to his truck? What could he say that would reframe this, whether the smile would still work here? The 2 plainclothes deputies stood up from the middle of the crowd. Craig saw them, and the calculation stopped. Dennis placed the forged deed on the table beside the notebook. 47 acres of timberland, Cherokee County. Tom's signature forged on the transfer documents. Class H felony in North Carolina. Roy stood up from his seat and set the manila envelope on the table. 63 photographs. He said, his voice rough and steady. Everyone dated, front and back. He looked around at the people he'd known for 30 years. I took them through my fence because I couldn't do anything else. I should have done more. I'm sorry I didn't." June was crying openly beside him, not hiding it, not wiping her face. Pastor David rose from his chair at the end of the table and placed the CPS closure letter down. "I filed this report 14 months ago," he said. "The system closed it for insufficient evidence. I kept the letter because I believed the evidence would come." He looked at Walter. It came, Walter. Donna had gone white. She grabbed Ruth's arm and Ruth grabbed her back, the two of them holding each other up like two people suddenly standing on ground that had stopped being solid. Walter set his bourbon glass down very carefully on the table. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and laid Ellie's phone flat on the white cloth. 6 months of video documentation, I said. Recorded by a 17-year-old girl who was afraid her own father wouldn't believe her without proof. My voice went rough on that sentence, and I didn't try to smooth it. She was right to be afraid of that. That one's on me. The deputies moved toward Craig. "This is a misunderstanding," Craig said loudly, looking around at the crowd. "This is a Tom. Listen, we can talk about this. There are two sides to every Craig Mercer." The deputy on his left had his badge out. "You're under arrest for forgery of a deed, fraud in the obtaining of property, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation. You have the right to remain silent." Craig looked around the tables at 62 families watching him, and for the first time since I'd started, the ease left his face entirely. What was underneath it was not what I expected. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was the blank, exposed look of a man who has been performing for so long that he's forgotten there was a self underneath the performance. They walked him out through the entrance. The fire crackled. Nobody spoke. Walter was still standing at the far end of the tables. He had not moved. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 20 years of knowing him. Not anger, not calculation, not the warm, social ease he wore like a work coat. He was looking at me the way a man looks when he has just understood that the ground under everything he believed has given way, and he is standing in the air above the drop, and he knows it. He knew I wasn't finished. The fire crackled and spat, and the smoke drifted sideways in the cold mountain air, and 62 families sat at those long white tables and did not make a sound. Walter was still standing. His hands were at his sides. His bourbon glass was on the table where he'd set it down, and he hadn't touched it since. "Walter," I said. "I'm not done." He looked at me. His jaw was set. In 20 years, I had watched Walter Calloway face down bank officers, county commissioners, neighbors who owed him money, and men twice his size who'd made the mistake of underestimating him. He had never once looked uncertain. He looked uncertain now, not of what I was going to say, I think, but of whether he was going to be able to hold himself together when I said it. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket for the second time that evening. The document I placed on the table was not the forged deed. It was not the bank statements or the CPS letter. It was a single sheet of paper folded once that I had been carrying in my breast pocket for 17 days. I had pressed it flat every morning and folded it again every evening, and I had not looked at it more times than I needed to, because looking at it too many times made it hard to function. I unfolded it and laid it flat on the white cloth. "Ellie," I said. "Come stand with me." She came. She stood beside me and looked at the document, and I watched her read it, and I watched the color leave her face, and then slowly, slowly come back. Birth certificate. State of North Carolina. Child Ellie Margaret Calloway. Date of birth March 4th, 2007. Mother Margaret Ann Calloway. Father Daniel James Calloway. I looked up at Walter. The change in his face was not dramatic. It did not happen all at once. It moved through him the way weather moves through a valley, a shift in the light, a drop in temperature, a stillness that wasn't there before. He looked at the document. He looked at Ellie. He looked at the document again. "See, Daniel," he said. His voice came out as something I had never heard from Walter Calloway. Fractured, small. The voice of a man who has just looked down and seen the bottom drop out of a world he thought he understood. Ruth made a sound behind him that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a woman who has just been handed back something she buried, and the joy and the grief arrived at exactly the same moment, and neither one won. She grabbed the back of Walter's arm with both hands, and her legs went, and Walter caught her, and they stood there holding each other up, two old people in the cold December air, and Ruth was sobbing with her whole body, not quietly, not with dignity, with everything she had. The way grief comes when it has been stored up too long in too small a space. "She's Daniel's," Walter said. He was not saying it to me. He was saying it to himself, to Ruth, to the air, to whatever accounting system he believed in. "She's Daniel's girl. She has been Daniel's girl," I said, "every single day of her life. That did not change based on what you called her." Walter flinched. The first time I had ever seen Walter Calloway flinch. He looked at Ellie. Really looked the way he had never once looked at her in 15 years of her living in his orbit. And I watched something happen in his face that I did not expect and did not know how to account for. His eyes filled. Walter Calloway, who had run this county for 30 years on borrowed money and cold authority, who had never once in my presence shown a crack in that surface, his eyes filled and spilled over, and he made no move to stop it or hide it. He took a step toward Ellie. Then he stopped. Because Ellie had not moved. She was standing very straight, her hands at her sides, the mountain pendant catching the firelight at her throat. She was looking at him with Daniel's eyes, the same dark brown, the same direct focus, the same quality of attention that did not blink or look away. "Ellie." Walter's voice broke completely on her name. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Ellie said. Her voice was quiet and steady, and it went through that cold December air like a blade through water. "You decided what I was, and you never asked." Walter's chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders shook once hard, then again. Then he did something that made the 62 families around those tables go so quiet, I could hear the fire and nothing else. He lowered himself to his knees on the cold ground, not dramatically, not performatively. He simply went down slowly, the way a very large and very old tree finally goes down, not falling, lowering, as if the ground had been waiting for him. Ruth was crying so hard she couldn't stand. June Aldridge had gotten up from her seat and put her arms around Ruth's shoulders, and Ruth was gripping June's coat in both fists and weeping into her shoulder. This woman who had called my daughter a bastard child in front of neighbors, this woman who had pressed Ellie's wrist like a handcuff, weeping in the arms of the neighbor she'd threatened, and June was holding her anyway, because June was the kind of person who did that. Then Mason moved. He was sitting at the far end of the children's table, 11 years old, in his good shirt, understanding perhaps a third of what had been said tonight, and understanding enough. He stood up. He walked around the outside of the long tables, slowly looking at the ground, until he reached the place where Ellie was standing. He stopped beside her. He reached out and put his small hand over hers. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry. I really didn't know." Ellie looked down at his hand on hers. Then she looked at him, this boy who had eaten while she stood in the kitchen, who had broken things and let her take the blame, who had grown up inside a system that had used him as much as it had used everyone else. She turned her hand over and held his. I stood there and watched my daughter, Daniel's daughter, hold the hand of a boy who hadn't known in front of 62 families, who had believed the wrong story for 15 years, in the light of a December fire on a mountain in North Carolina. I had one more thing to say. I looked out at the faces around those tables and I said, "There's something else I need to tell you. About the day Daniel died. About a phone call I didn't make." My voice went rough and I let it. "I've been carrying this for 15 years and it's time to put it down." The fire crackled. The smoke drifted. Nobody moved. And I told them. I told them everything. I told them about the ridge fracture I had reported and the foreman who had waved me off. I told them about the phone call I made and the phone call I didn't make. I told them about standing in that cabin doorway, turning Daniel's number over in my hand and putting the phone in my pocket instead. When I finished, the fire was the only sound in Cherokee County. Then Ellie reached over and put her hand on top of mine where it rested on the table. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand there, warm and real and steady, and left it. Walter was still on his knees. He looked up at me from the ground, and his voice came out wrecked and stripped to the bone. "Why didn't you tell us all these years, Tom? Why didn't you tell us she was Daniel's? Because you said it was Margaret's fault he died," I said. "You said it the night we lost them both. I was holding Ellie when you said it." I looked at him steadily. I wasn't going to put Daniel's daughter in a house where her mother's name was spoken like a curse. Walter pressed both hands over his face. His shoulders shook. Beside him, Ruth reached down and put her hand on his back. The same Ruth who had locked my daughter's bedroom door, who had pressed Ellie's wrist like a handcuff, who had called her the girl for 3 years. And she was weeping so hard she could barely stand. And she was the one keeping Walter upright. I don't have a clean word for what I felt watching that. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something more like witnessing being present for the exact moment when a person understands the full weight of what they've done, and there's nothing left to do but hold it. We drove home at 10 o'clock. Ellie in the passenger seat, the heat on the mountain road, dark and familiar on either side. Neither of us spoke for the first 5 miles, and it wasn't the heavy silence of things unsaid, it was the quiet of 2 people who had been through something enormous together and were still finding the edges of it. "Are you okay?" Ellie asked. "Getting there," I said. "You?" "Getting there," she said, and almost smiled. I came home to a house with no Donna in it. She had taken what she could carry and left sometime between the potluck and midnight. I found out later she'd driven to her cousin's place in Asheville. She didn't get far. Dennis had already coordinated with Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, and she was taken into custody the following morning without incident. On the kitchen table she had left the silver necklace, not in the cedar box, just lying there on the white tablecloth, coiled like a question mark, the mountain pendant face down so I couldn't see the inscription. Whether she left it out of guilt or practicality or some impulse she couldn't have explained herself, I don't know. I picked it up and held it in my palm and felt the weight of 15 years in something smaller than a silver dollar. The next morning, I made scrambled eggs. Ellie came downstairs in her socks and her hair going in 4 directions and stopped in the kitchen doorway when she smelled the food. "Sit down," I said. "It's ready?" She sat at the table, her chair, the one she'd always had, the one that had been hers before any of this, and I set the plate in front of her and sat across from her, and we ate together in the December morning light coming through the kitchen window. When the plates were cleared, I set the necklace on the table between us. Ellie went very still. "Your mother wore this every day," I said. "Margaret. She never took it off. When they found her, it was still there. Still on her." My voice thinned and I steadied it. Daniel had the inscription put in the day you were born. He called me from the jeweler so excited he could barely talk straight. Said he wanted her to carry your name close. I pushed the necklace gently toward her. Your dad wanted your mom to carry your name. I've been carrying it since 2009. It's time it went to you. Ellie picked it up with both hands. Her fingers healed now the cracks closed a 17-year-old's hands again, turned the pendant over, and read the inscription. Ellie. She pressed the pendant against her chest with both hands and bent forward over the table and cried. Not quietly, not with control. She cried the way a person cries when something has been held back past all reasonable capacity. Her whole body shaking, her breath coming in ragged pulls, 15 years of being called the girl and the bastard, and the difficult one releasing all at once in my kitchen on a December morning. I got up and went around the table and put my hand on her back and left it there. She loved you, I said. She loved you before she ever got to know you. That's what that inscription means. You were named and claimed and loved before you took your first breath. My own eyes were burning so hard I couldn't see straight. Nobody gets to take that from you. Nobody ever did. Ellie straightened up eventually. She wiped her face hard with both palms, a fierce, practical gesture, and clasped the necklace around her own neck with steady hands. Epilogue. April 2025. Donna received 3 years. Craig Mercer received 7 with an additional federal charge for the structuring violations that added 18 months. Walter and Ruth were not criminally charged, but Walter's network of land notes dissolved overnight. Roy's debt was formally cleared by court order as proceeds of financial coercion. Mason went to live with a cousin of Donna's in Knoxville, who had no part in any of it. He called Ellie once in February, and she answered, and they talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and when she hung up, she came to find me in the backyard and said, "He's going to be okay, I think." I said, "Yeah, I think so too." Walter and Ruth asked to see Ellie in March. She agreed once at Roy and June's kitchen table with me beside her. Ruth held Ellie's hands and could not stop crying. Walter sat across from her and said, "You have Daniel's hands. I should have seen it the first day." Ellie said, "Yes, you should have." She didn't say anything else, but she didn't leave either. And when it was time to go, she stood up and looked at her grandmother, this woman who had made her life unlivable, and said, "I'll think about it." Meaning whether there was anything left to build. Whether 15 years of damage had a road back. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a door left open a crack. That was more than they deserved, and exactly what Ellie chose to give. In April, I drove home from a short contract in Bryson City, 2 weeks close enough to sleep in my own bed, half the time close enough to matter. I turned onto Ridgeline Road in the late afternoon, and the mountain light was doing what it does in April, that particular gold that comes through the new leaves, green and warm and full of the feeling that things are starting again. Ellie was on the porch. I pulled into the driveway and cut the engine and looked in the rearview mirror. She was standing there in her jacket with the mountain pendant catching the light at her throat, and she raised her hand, one slow wave, deliberate and unhurried. I sat in that truck for a long moment. Then I got out. "You waiting for someone?" I called up to the porch. "You," she said. "I was waiting for you." I walked up the porch steps and stood beside my daughter in the April light and looked out at the mountain we had both grown up on, and the trees were coming back green after a hard winter, and the air smelled like pine and thaw and the particular promise of a season that hasn't decided yet what it's going to be. That was enough. More than enough. It still is. I'm just a timberman from the mountains of North Carolina. I spent 15 years carrying a guilt I never spoke aloud, and 3 more years looking straight at the wrong things happening in my own house because I needed them to be fine. Don't be like me. If there's a child in your life who says I'm fine in a voice that means the opposite, stop. Put down whatever you're carrying and really look. Not at the story someone else told you about that child. At the child. The weight in their eyes. The way they hold their food. The way they flinch before they smile. I believe God put me on that mountain road at 4 in the morning for a reason. Not to punish anyone. To bring me home in time to still matter. This is my family revenge. Not the courthouse, not the handcuffs, not Walter on his knees in the December cold. My family revenge is a girl in an April porch light, with her mother's necklace at her throat, waving at me like she knew I was coming home. These grandpastries aren't always easy to tell, but I think the hard ones are the ones worth hearing. Because somewhere out there, there's a child holding a $30 phone in the dark building, a case nobody asked them to build, hoping someone will finally believe them. Believe them. If this revenge story stayed with you, if you've seen something like it, or lived something like it, tell me in the comments. Your words might be the thing someone else needs to read today. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if these grandpastries speak to you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Every family revenge we tell here is another story worth witnessing. Thank you for staying with me until the end. It means more than I know how to say. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted to carry a message worth hearing. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Step away and find what feeds your soul.